Hey guys, tonight we're going to talk about something quietly tragic, a little bit ironic, and entirely soaked in royal drama. So if you're lying in bed, lights low, tea lukewarm, maybe already halfway to sleep, perfect, because we're gliding into the calm, sad, and occasionally ridiculous world of royal widows, specifically the wives of executed kings. Now, you might think being a queen comes with a few perks: crown, jewels, palaces, probably someone whose full-time job is just to fan you during meals. But history, as usual, had other plans. Royal life came with one major occupational hazard. Your husband might get his head chopped off, usually in front of a very enthusiastic crowd. And when that happened, the queen didn't exactly get to retire quietly to a lakeside villa. More often, she became political baggage, a living embarrassment, or a very convenient hostage. So tonight, we'll drift through some of those stories. Some of these women lost everything, some reinvented themselves, and some were just quietly erased. Let's start with one of Europe's most famous royal disasters, the French Revolution's favorite scapegoat, Marie Antoinette. Marie Antoinette is one of those people history insists on turning into a meme. She never actually said, "let them eat cake," but it fits the vibe so perfectly that no one cares anymore. Born in 1755, she was an Austrian archduchess who married the awkward, indecisive Louis XVI. Together, they ruled France, sort of. Mostly they avoided ruling and hosted elaborate costume balls. By the time things went wrong, it wasn't really her fault. The French economy was already doing its best impression of a burning building. But when people are starving, they tend to look at the nearest woman wearing diamonds the size of grapes and go, "Her, she did it." When the revolution hit, the royal couple was caught like two deer in a political firing squad. They tried to escape, disguised, badly, and were caught because of course they were. Louis XVI was executed in January 1793. Now, that's where our story begins, because Marie Antoinette didn't die right away. She got a front row seat to her own downfall. For months after her husband's execution, she was kept in the Temple prison, a damp, echoing tower where time crawled and hope went to die quietly in a corner. Her children were taken from her one by one. Her guards reported on her every word. The widow of an executed king wasn't just a sad figure, she was a threat, because as long as she was alive, someone could claim her as a rallying point, a symbol of the old monarchy. And revolutionary France didn't like symbols that made people nostalgic. So after months of waiting, humiliation, and public hatred, she was brought to trial. It wasn't really a trial, more like a public performance with an inevitable ending. In October 1793, she was sentenced to death. On the morning of her execution, Marie Antoinette accidentally stepped on the executioner's foot and quietly said, "Pardon me, sir, I did not do it on purpose." That's her last recorded sentence. Graceful, polite, and a little bit heartbreaking even at the edge of the guillotine. And when the blade fell, the crowd cheered, as if they'd just finished watching a particularly dramatic play. After all, that's what the revolution had become, a theater of death. Marie Antoinette's story ended where her husband's had, but not all royal widows were granted the mercy of dying quickly. Some lived for decades after their king's execution, in very uncomfortable circumstances. Let's drift over to England for our next tale, a story of politics, regicide, and one quietly resilient woman named Henrietta Maria. England in the 1600s was in a perpetual mood swing. One day, it was monarchy. The next, it was Puritan Republic. Then, monarchy again, like a government run by a malfunctioning light switch. Henrietta Maria was a French princess who married King Charles I of England. He was a man of delicate taste, artistic vision, and the kind of stubbornness that makes your advisors age prematurely. She was Catholic, in a very Protestant country. From day one, that was a problem. To the English Parliament, Henrietta Maria was basically the Antichrist in pearls. During the English Civil War, as her husband's army crumbled, She fled to France. She tried to rally support, send money, and arrange aid, but by 1649, Charles I had lost everything, including his head. The execution of a king was shocking enough, but for Henrietta Maria, it was also personal and political. As the widow of the executed monarch, she became a royal ghost. England had no place for her. She stayed in exile, living in various French palaces that weren't really hers, surviving mostly on borrowed dignity and nostalgia. Her son, Charles II, eventually restored the monarchy years later, but by then, Henrietta Maria was old, frail, and quietly fading out of public life. She spent her last years at a convent, far from the noise of the throne that had destroyed her husband. She died in 1669. And honestly, she got off easy by royal widow standards, because while she lived out her exile in peace, others weren't so lucky. Some were imprisoned for life, some forced into remarriage, and some, like poor Anne Boleyn, didn't even survive their husbands' reigns.
So let's glide softly from revolutionary France to Tudor England. Different continent, same general mood. Too many crowns, too much ego, and way too many executions. England in the 1500s was basically a royal soap opera, but with less kissing and more decapitation. At the center of it all stood Henry VIII, a man with 6 wives and one extremely fragile sense of self-control. Anne Boleyn was wife number 2. But really, she was the wife that started it all. Without her, England might have stayed Catholic, the Pope might have kept his influence, and Henry might have just stayed married to Catherine of Aragon, sulking quietly about not having a son. But Anne wasn't the type to sit quietly. She was witty, ambitious, and dangerously charismatic. All the worst traits for a woman in a court where obedience was a survival skill. Henry fell for her hard. So hard that he tore his entire country apart trying to marry her. When the Pope refused to grant a divorce from Catherine, Henry said, "Fine, I'll make my own church." And that's how England got the Church of England, because a king wanted to remarry. Very theological. Anne became queen in 1533, glowing with victory, and probably a mild sense of, "Oh no, what have I done?" She gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth, who'd later become one of England's greatest monarchs. But in Henry's mind, that was sort of like ordering a steak and getting a salad. He wanted a son, he got a future icon instead. And when Anne failed to produce that male heir, her enemies moved in like sharks, smelling blood. The court whispered. The advisors plotted. Henry, of course, started flirting with someone else because he was Henry. By 1536, Anne was accused of adultery, witchcraft, and even incest. Because if you're going to ruin someone, why not go for the dramatic package? Her trial was a farce. Everyone knew the verdict before it began. And when the time came, she faced it with eerie calm. She didn't scream or beg. She just knelt down, whispered her final prayer, and the sword fell. She was 35. Her daughter, little Elizabeth, was declared illegitimate. So, what happened to her afterwards? Well, not much, because that's the cruel irony of being the wife of an executed king, or in Anne's case, being executed by one. The world forgets you fast. Anne's family was disgraced, her brother dead, her household scattered. Her memory was quietly erased from royal portraits, tapestries, and records. But years later, her daughter Elizabeth would rebuild that memory, turning her mother's ghost into a legend of quiet defiance. So in a way, Anne Boleyn won, just not in time to see it. But Henry wasn't finished with his cycle of royal misery, because just 5 years later, he'd repeat the same trick. Another young wife, another accusation, another beheading. Let's float now to Catherine Howard, the teenage bride who thought she'd found love and found the Tower of London instead.
So, we've seen Anne Boleyn fall. Henry VIII mourned her for, maybe a week. Then, like a man browsing for shoes, he moved on to the next option. By the time Catherine Howard entered his life, Henry was older, heavier, and perpetually in a bad mood. His leg wound constantly oozed, his temper was worse, and his doctors were probably on the verge of inventing modern psychiatry just to cope. Catherine, meanwhile, was about 17, young, beautiful, lively, and about as politically naive as a golden retriever in a chess tournament. She was Anne Boleyn's cousin, because apparently the Tudor dating pool was just one big family reunion. She caught Henry's eye at court, and that was that. By 1540, she became his fifth wife. Now, for about 6 months, things looked fine. Henry was happy again, parading her around like a trophy that proved he still had it. He called her his rose without a thorn, which is poetic, but also, in hindsight, not very accurate, because Catherine had a past, one that didn't fit the saintly image Henry wanted. Before she married the king, she'd been involved with a few men at court, normal enough for her age. Catastrophic when you're married to a king who beheaded his last wife for infidelity. Soon enough, gossip started. Letters were found, and Henry's advisors, always eager to stay alive, brought him the bad news. He didn't take it well. In November 1541, Catherine was arrested. She was barely 20. They said she'd committed treason because adultery, when you're married to a monarch, counts as that. When she was told of her sentence, she reportedly asked for the execution block to be brought to her cell so she could practice laying her head on it. That's a level of calm most of us will never achieve. On February 13th, 1542, she was beheaded in the Tower of London, on the same ground where her cousin Anne Boleyn had died 6 years before. 2 women, 2 cousins, 2 queens, and 1 extremely unstable husband with a sharp sword collection. The thing about Henry VIII's wives is that they weren't just victims of his mood swings. They were victims of an entire system that treated women as both currency and decoration. When a queen fell out of favor, she didn't just lose her position, she lost her identity. And yet, Henry kept marrying, because of course he did. After Catherine came Catherine Parr, the 6th and final wife, who managed to outlive him, mostly by reading theology and staying quiet. A queen who survived by the radical act of minding her own business. But we'll come back to her later. For now, let's drift away from Henry's England. Let's cross the cold North Sea and land in Scotland, where another tragic royal woman was about to meet her own doom. Her name was Mary Stuart, better known as Mary, Queen of Scots, a woman whose entire life was a slow-motion fall from grace, born to rule, raised to shine, and destined to die alone in a foreign castle. Mary was born into chaos, which, honestly, was standard for 16th century royalty. Her father, King James V of Scotland, died when she was just 6 days old. So from the very beginning, she was a queen without a clue and a target on her back. She was sent to France as a child to be raised at court and married to the French Dauphin. It sounded like a fairy tale setup, elegant, glittering, and just a bit doomed. She married young, became Queen of France briefly, and then, just as quickly, became a widow when her husband died of an ear infection that turned into something worse. Because, yes, in the 1500s, you could die of an ear infection. So, Mary returned to Scotland. She was about 18, beautiful, educated, multilingual, and completely unprepared for the mess waiting back home. Scotland wasn't exactly thrilled to have her back. Her nobles were power-hungry, her half-brother was scheming, and her cousin, Elizabeth I of England, was watching everything with one raised, skeptical eyebrow. Mary married again, this time to Lord Darnley. He was handsome, charming, and catastrophically unstable. Think Tudor-era walking red flag. They had one son, the future James VI of England, but the marriage collapsed faster than a poorly built banquet table. Darnley was jealous, violent, and soon dead. Officially, He was murdered by unknown assailants. Unofficially, everyone knew Mary's associates had something to do with it. Then, in a decision that historians still sigh about, Mary married the man suspected of killing her husband, because why not double down? Her nobles rebelled. She was imprisoned. She escaped. She fled to England, hoping her cousin Elizabeth would help. She shouldn't have. Elizabeth saw her as both a threat and a birder. So instead of a warm welcome, Mary got 19 years of imprisonment. 19 years, locked in drafty castles, moved from one damp room to another, writing letters that would eventually get her killed. In 1586, her secret correspondence was intercepted, letters that seemed to support a plot to assassinate Elizabeth. That was all it took. Mary was tried, condemned, and executed at Fotheringham Castle. When the axe fell, it took 3 strikes, because apparently even death by beheading couldn't be done efficiently in Tudor England. Her little dog reportedly ran out from under her skirts after she died, trembling and covered in blood, and the crowd stayed silent. Mary's son would go on to become James I of England, uniting the 2 crowns. So in the end, her bloodline achieved what she couldn't, a quiet, ironic victory. But for Mary herself, her life was one long lesson in the futility of royal dreams.
Some royal wives lose their heads. Others just lose everything else. Titles, lands, children, even the right to be remembered. Because sometimes being the widow of an executed king wasn't a death sentence. It was a life sentence. A long, silent existence spent in exile, waiting for a world that had already moved on. So tonight, we drift gently toward those women, the ones who outlived their crowns, who went from queens to refugees in a single afternoon. Let's begin with Catherine of Aragon, the woman who accidentally started the Reformation and spent her last years praying for the husband who destroyed her. Before Anne Boleyn, before the religious chaos and the new church, there was Catherine, a Spanish princess, a Habsburg by blood, meaning genetically she was already playing with dangerous family ratios. She married Henry VIII in 1509. She was graceful, devout, politically shrewd, and genuinely loved by the English people. But after years of miscarriages and stillbirths, she gave Henry only one surviving child, a daughter, Mary, and that wasn't enough for him. After nearly 20 years of marriage, Henry decided he wanted someone new. Catherine was too old, he said. God was punishing him for marrying his brother's widow, he said. But mostly, he just wanted Anne Boleyn. When the Pope refused to annul the marriage, Henry tore up the rule book. He declared himself head of the Church of England, divorced Catherine, and banished her from court. She was forbidden to see her daughter again. She was stripped of her title. Her letters to Henry went unanswered, and yet she never stopped signing herself Catherine, the Queen. She died alone in 1536 in a cold, drafty castle called Kimbolton, still wearing her widow's black because she considered herself married to Henry until her last breath. When he heard her death, Henry reportedly wept, or maybe he just had indigestion. With Henry, it's always hard to tell. Either way, Catherine's story set the tone for every wife who came after, loved, discarded, and left to fade into the background noise of history. But some didn't fade so quietly. Some refused to go down without a final act of defiance, like the woman who became the last Queen of France before the Revolution, Marie Antoinette's mother-in-law, the formidable Marie Lizczynska. Before Marie Antoinette ever flitted through Versailles with her powdered hair and ribbons, there was Marie Lizczynska, a woman so quiet that most people forget she existed at all. She married Louis XV in 1725, and for the first 10 years, they actually seemed happy, which for French royalty is practically a miracle. Then, predictably, he grew bored. The mistresses came,
a parade of polished, perfumed replacements, while Marie retreated into the background, devoting herself to religion, charity, and the art of dignified invisibility. When Louis XV died in 1774, she had already been gone for years, but her ghost lingered in Versailles, a quiet reminder of what royal women were expected to be: ornamental when young, invisible when old. She wasn't executed, she wasn't exiled. She just faded out, like candle smoke at the end of a long, exhausting evening. And yet, her granddaughter-in-law, Marie Antoinette, would live the same story at a much higher volume: gilded excess, public hatred, and a death before a cheering crowd. It's almost as if the monarchy kept writing the same script, just with louder costumes. But not every royal wife accepted her exile gracefully. Some fought back, loudly, dramatically, and to the horror of every advisor in the palace. Caroline of Brunswick was one of them. She married George IV of England, a man famous for debt, vanity, and an impressive talent for avoiding responsibility. Their marriage was doomed from the first minute. When George saw her for the first time, he reportedly said, "Bring me brandy," which honestly sets the tone for everything that followed. They separated almost immediately. Caroline went abroad, traveling through Europe, collecting friends, scandals, and rumors like souvenirs. Years later, when George became king, Caroline returned to England, demanding to be recognized as queen. The government tried everything to keep her quiet: public trials, smear campaigns, legal threats. None of it worked. Caroline attended her own trial like it was theater, bowing to the audience and waving at the crowd. In the end, she wasn't executed. She just wasn't allowed to attend her husband's coronation. She died shortly afterwards from illness, exhaustion, and probably a broken heart. But she did something extraordinary. She forced the monarchy to face public humiliation on its own stage. She made being a royal wife look like a performance, and made sure everyone saw behind the curtain. Sometimes the royal widow story doesn't end with quiet resignation. Sometimes it ends with a plot. Louisa Ulrika of Prussia married the King of Sweden in the 18th century. She was intelligent, proud, and just a bit too ambitious for her new home. After her husband's death, she tried to stage a coup against her own son, because really, what else is there to do in 18th century Sweden when embroidery gets boring? It failed, of course. She was placed under house arrest, stripped of power, and left to brood in her palace with her letters and regrets. But history remembers her more than a failed schemer. She was the mother of Gustav III, the theater king of Sweden, who'd later be assassinated at a masquerade ball. So even when Louisa Ulrika vanished from view, her story lingered, woven into the next generation's downfall. And that's the strange comfort in these stories. Queens come and go, heads roll, thrones crumble, but the patterns stay. For every executed king, there's a widow quietly folding away her crown, a ghost lingering in an empty hall, a name fading from the royal registry like ink in rain. Let's float then toward colder lands, to the east, where royal widows didn't just mourn their husbands, they inherited their thrones. They ruled, plotted, and survived palace coups that would make Henry VIII look like an amateur.
Russia doesn't really do moderate history. When its monarchs loved, they adored. When they ruled, they conquered. And when they died, they made sure everyone noticed. So it's no surprise that the widows of Russian emperors lived lives that were equal parts devotion, intrigue, and mild madness. Let's start with the woman who went from palace maid to empress, Catherine I of Russia, the first in a long line of women who'd rule the empire with a calm hand and, occasionally, a suspiciously well-timed coup. Catherine I wasn't born royal. In fact, she wasn't even born Russian. She was a Lithuanian peasant named Marta, or possibly a Latvian servant. The records are hazy because 17th century record-keeping was mostly vibes and handwriting. She was captured during a war, passed from household to household, and eventually ended up in the orbit of Peter the Great, the man who modernized Russia through sheer force of will and possibly caffeine. Peter adored her. She made him laugh, which for Peter, a man who once personally performed dental surgery on his courtiers for fun, was apparently a rare talent. They married, unofficially at first, and eventually Peter made it official, crowning her empress before his death in 1725. When Peter died, the court panicked. No one was sure who should rule, so Catherine did what most royal widows dream about but rarely achieve. She took the throne herself. For 2 brief, careful years, she ruled Russia. Her main policy was essentially, don't break anything Peter built. And then, quietly, she died, leaving behind an empire still unsure how it felt about being run by women. But she opened the door, and a few decades later, another Catherine would walk right through it, wearing diamonds, plotting coups, and taking lovers like it was an Olympic event. Catherine II, better known as Catherine the Great, is one of those historical figures who makes you wonder whether anyone else in the 18th century was even trying. She wasn't born Russian either. She was a minor German princess named Sophie, married off to the future emperor Peter III. Peter was difficult, immature, erratic, fond of toy soldiers, and deeply uninterested in his wife. Catherine, on the other hand, was brilliant, ambitious, and very, very patient. When Peter became emperor, his bizarre policies and his open admiration for Prussia made everyone nervous. Within 6 months, Catherine staged a coup. Peter was arrested, and shortly afterward, he was found dead under mysterious circumstances, which in Russian history usually means absolutely not mysterious at all. Catherine took the throne and ruled for 34 years. Widowhood suited her. She expanded the empire, reformed the government, and corresponded with Enlightenment philosophers while maintaining a revolving door of handsome advisors. To the court, she was terrifyingly competent. To the outside world, she was fascinating. And to her late husband's supporters, she was simply the woman who got away with everything. When she died in 1996, she left behind an empire twice the size it had been, and a dynasty that would spend the next century trying and failing to live up to her legend. But while Catherine the Great's story is all grandeur and glitter, most imperial widows weren't so lucky. For every woman who seized the throne, there were 5 more who ended up as polite ghosts haunting the edges of palaces. Fast forward to the 19th century. Russia was now a world power, and its royal family, the Romanovs, had mastered the art of looking composed while quietly imploding. Maria Fedorovna, wife of Tsar Alexander III, was the kind of woman who made etiquette seem like a full-time profession. Born a Danish princess, she married into the Russian royal family at 18 and did everything right. Charitable, graceful, perfectly dressed, and capable of holding a teacup like it was a diplomatic weapon. Her husband, Alexander III, was large, stern, and famously conservative, but he adored her. When he died in 1894, Maria's world contracted. Her son, Nicholas II, became Tsar, and suddenly she was the widow in the background. Respected, but irrelevant. She never liked Nicholas's wife, Alexandra. Almost no one did. And she disapproved of that mysterious man who kept showing up to dinner, a certain Grigory Rasputin. But despite the family chaos, Maria kept her dignity. She lived through the fall of the monarchy, fleeing the revolution in 1919 aboard a British ship. She died in exile in Denmark, an empress without an empire, a mother who had outlived almost everything she'd loved. Her son, Nicholas, her daughter-in-law, and her grandchildren had been executed by Bolsheviks a year before. Maria never accepted it. She insisted they were alive somewhere, and maybe in her mind they were. The Russian royal widows were survivors by design. They knew the walls of palaces could whisper, that loyalty was just another currency, and that every crown came with an expiration date. Each one of them, from Catherine I's humble rise to Maria Fedorovna's lonely exile, carried the same quiet truth that royalty doesn't protect, it only delays the inevitable. And with that, we drift a little further south to a world of silks, shadows, and whispered plots, a place where widows didn't mourn in black, but ruled from behind screens and veils. Next, we'll step into the Ottoman Empire, where royal widows became the real power in the palace, mothers of sultans, guardians of dynasties, and quiet architects of empires.
The Ottoman Empire lasted over 600 years, and for most of that time, the men wore the crowns, but the women wore the patience. You see, the Sultan might sit on the throne, but behind him, behind the silk screens and golden doors, were the real operators, the Valid Sultans, the mothers and widows who turned mourning into political management. They didn't fight wars. They didn't sign decrees, at least not openly, but they could decide who lived in the palace, who became the next heir, and sometimes who mysteriously disappeared during a quiet night on the Bosphorus. Let's start with the woman who changed all of that. A widow named Harem Sultan, known in the West as Roxalana. Harem's story reads like a romance novel that somehow wandered into a political thriller. She was born around 1500 in what's now Ukraine, captured by Tatars and sold into slavery. She eventually ended up in the imperial harem of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, and if you're wondering why he's called that, it's because he really did live like the main character of world history. Harem quickly rose through the ranks of the harem, not by beauty alone, though she had that too, but through sharp intelligence and a perfectly calibrated charm. She laughed at Suleiman's jokes. She wrote him poems, and somehow, in a palace full of rivals, she became the one woman he couldn't replace. Against every Ottoman custom, Suleiman freed her and married her, an act so shocking that even his advisors went pale. Sultans weren't supposed to marry their concubines, and they certainly weren't supposed to take relationship advice from them, but he did. When Suleiman died, Harem had already secured her legacy. Her sons were heirs. Her influence had reshaped court politics forever. She never lived to see her children take the throne, but her model, the powerful widowed mother, became a permanent part of Ottoman politics. A generation later came Nurbanu Sultan, a Venetian-born woman who entered the harem as a slave and ended up controlling the empire from a curtained window. She was the wife of Selim II, a sultan better known for his love of wine than his love of governance. While Selim enjoyed his vineyards, Nurbanu quietly built alliances. When he died, suddenly and, let's be honest, not sober, their son, Murad III, became sultan, and Nurbanu became the Valid Sultan, the queen mother, and the empire's most powerful person. She ran the palace like a strategist. Every visitor, every letter, every whisper that passed through the harem ran through her delicate, decisive hands. Foreign ambassadors bowed to her judgment. Ministers consulted her, and though she ruled from the shadows, her shadow covered the empire. When she died in 1583, Venice mourned her as one of their own, and Istanbul exhaled. Finally, they thought, someone else would take the reins. They were wrong, because behind her came another widow, equally calm, equally calculating, Kosum Sultan. If history had job titles, Kosum would have Empire Manager engraved on her business card. She arrived as a Greek slave girl, charmed Sultan Ahmed I, and after his death, became the de facto ruler through multiple reigns, her sons and later her grandsons. She was patient, motherly when needed, merciless when required. The empire trusted her steadiness, even as the sultans themselves grew weaker, younger, and often more ornamental than functional. Kosum's power wasn't official, but everyone knew she held it. When ambassadors wanted to influence policy, they didn't visit the sultan. They visited his mother. And then came the tragedy that defines her legacy. Her grandson, Mehmed IV, was put on the throne as a child. Kosum acted as regent once again, but the boy's mother, Turhan Sultan, wasn't happy about playing second fiddle. What followed was one of the quietest coups in history. One night in 1651, Kosum was found dead, strangled with her own curtain cord. It was said that Turhan's servants did it, and that Turhan herself wept while it happened, because in Ottoman politics, power was always personal. Turhan may have killed her mother-in-law, but she kept her throne spotless. After Kosum's death, she ruled as Valid Sultan until her own son came to age. Unlike many before her, she invested heavily in architecture and charity. She commissioned mosques, schools, and the famous Yeni Jami, whose towering domes still rise over Istanbul's skyline. When she died in 1683, she was buried beside her husband in a dynasty that had learned to quietly fear its women. The widows of the Ottoman Empire weren't victims. They were the architects of survival. While the men went off to war, they stayed behind, weaving politics, pulling strings, and shaping the centuries from behind silk screens. Their grief became policy, their silence became strategy, and their stories remind us that power doesn't always need a throne. Sometimes it just needs patience and a locked door.
France has always treated its queens like theater. Each one got her entrance, her costumes, her scandals, and, if the mood soured, her dramatic exit. So tonight, we'll drift through 3 centuries of powdered tragedy, from the silk-lined chambers of Marie de Medici to the chaos surrounding Marie Antoinette, the last queen of France to lose not only her crown, but also her head. Let's start in the early 1600s, a time when France was obsessed with grandeur, and everyone smelled faintly of wax and ambition. Marie de Medici, a Florentine princess, married King Henry IV of France, a man charming enough to make enemies in every room he entered. Marie was elegant, cultured, and, unfortunately for her, foreign. The French court never fully accepted her. Henry had mistresses, of course, because fidelity was seen as more of a decorative gesture than a rule. But Marie endured. She gave him 6 children, decorated her palace with Italian art, and smiled through the gossip. Then, in 1610, Henry was assassinated. A sudden knife in the Paris streets, and Marie became a widow overnight. And not just any widow, but the Queen Regent, ruling for her young son, Louis XIII. At first, she managed well enough, but soon her Italian favorites angered the French nobles, and Louis XIII, once old enough to rule, promptly exiled his own mother. Marie de Medici spent the rest of her life wandering Europe like a very well-dressed ghost, begging for political asylum and painting commissions. When she died in Cologne in 1642, she was nearly broke. Her last letters still pleading with her son to forgive her. He never replied. Next came Anne of Austria, another foreign queen married into French politics. France loved foreign brides. They made excellent scapegoats. She married Louis XIII, the same son who had exiled his mother. The marriage was cold, formal, and for 20 years, mostly childless. But finally, after much praying, she gave birth to a son, Louis XIV, the future Sun King himself. When Louis XIII died, Anne became Queen Regent, and for a while, France was ruled by a quiet widow and a clever cardinal named Mazarin. The pair stabilized the kingdom, survived rebellions, and raised the boy who would go on to build Versailles and declare, quite modestly, "I am the state." Anne's widowhood was surprisingly peaceful by royal standards. She didn't lose her head. She didn't get exiled. She simply grew old, watched her son eclipse her entirely, and knew she'd preserved the crown. In France, that counted as a victory. Then came Marie Leszczyńska, a Polish princess who somehow found herself married to Louis XV, the great-grandson of the Sun King. She wasn't the most glamorous choice. Her dowry was small, and her name was hard to pronounce. But she was kind, modest, and, most importantly, available. For a while, it worked. She had 10 children, which sounds exhausting, and kept out of politics. Then Louis XV grew bored, which for French kings was a dangerous emotional state. Enter the mistresses. First the Duchesse de Châteauroux, then the legendary Madame de Pompadour, and later Madame du Barry, each more fashionable and influential than the last. Marie stayed in the background, polite and ignored, living long enough to see her grandchildren rise. When she died in 1768, Louis XV reportedly wept, perhaps from guilt, or perhaps because she had been the only genuinely decent person in his palace. And then, the queen whose name became shorthand for oblivious royalty, Marie Antoinette. She arrived from Austria at 14, married to the awkward Dauphin who would become Louis XVI. She was charming, bored, and disastrously young. Versailles was a place of whispers. Everything from her accent to her hairstyles became political. The French hated her spending, her foreign manners, and the small matter that the country was running out of money while she was commissioning diamond hairpieces. "Let them eat cake," she allegedly said, though she didn't actually say it. It was just too convenient a rumor for a hungry revolution. When the storming of the Bastille began, Marie's world collapsed in slow motion. The court fled, the mob came, and the monarchy, once the most powerful in Europe, was reduced to 2 terrified prisoners. Louis was executed in January 1793. Marie followed that October. Witnesses said she walked calmly to the guillotine, even apologizing to the executioner for stepping on his foot, because if France demanded dignity in death, she was going to deliver it. French royal widows rarely stayed quiet. They became regents, schemers, patrons, or martyrs. From Marie de Medici's painted self-pity to Marie Antoinette's doomed grace, each queen reflected the world collapsing around her. Beautiful, fragile, and always one whisper away from exile or execution. In France, a royal wedding was never just a romance. It was a political contract with an inevitable tragedy clause. And yet, even in their endings, these women shaped art, architecture, and diplomacy, proving that sometimes even a dying monarchy can leave behind exquisite ruins.
Northern Europe has a strange relationship with monarchy. The crowns are smaller, the castles colder, and the scandals somehow quieter, but every bit as miserable. If France gave us fireworks and guillotines, Scandinavia gave us melancholy portraits and sad letters written by candlelight. These weren't queens who went out in flames, they went out in sighs. Let's start with Queen Christina of Sweden, a woman who looked at absolute power and said, maybe not. Christina was born in 1626, the only surviving child of King Gustavus Adolphus, a national hero who died in battle when she was just 6 years old. Sweden adored him, and suddenly, the tiny, serious child left behind was proclaimed queen. She grew up brilliant, eccentric, and completely allergic to the idea of marriage. She collected art, read philosophy, and held salons where she debated Descartes until he died of pneumonia, because Stockholm was quite frankly freezing. Christina's courtiers kept pressing her to marry and produce an heir. Instead, she started dressing in men's clothes, studied Catholicism in secret, and began planning her escape. In 1654, she did something unthinkable. She abdicated the throne, handed the crown to her cousin, and fled south, disguised as a man. She converted to Catholicism in Rome, where she spent the rest of her life as an art patron, philosopher, and occasional troublemaker. The Swedish monarchy pretended she didn't exist, but Europe adored her. She was the queen who had everything and decided she wanted something else: freedom. When she died in 1689, the Vatican buried her among popes, a Protestant queen in Catholic marble. The perfect contradiction. Now let's drift across the Baltic to Denmark, where royal drama came wrapped in frost and scandal. Caroline Matilda, sister of Britain's King George III, was married off at 15 to King Christian VII of Denmark. He was handsome, charming, and mentally unstable. He talked to himself, performed public tantrums, and filled his palace with jesters. Caroline Matilda tried to make it work. She had a child, smiled at the right dinners, and endured the loneliness of being both foreign and trapped. Then came Johann Friedrich Struensee, the king's German doctor. He was intelligent, idealistic, and unfortunately for everyone, very attractive. He became the king's confidant and the queen's lover. Together, they reformed Denmark overnight, abolished torture, freed the press, modernized education, and without meaning to, terrified the nobility. Their affair became impossible to hide. In 1772, a coup erupted. Struensee was executed, and Caroline Mathilde was exiled, first to a remote castle, then to a lonely estate in northern Germany. She died of scarlet fever 3 years later, at just 23. The king never mentioned her again. He wandered the palace halls, talking to ghosts, and Denmark learned that even in the snow, passion could still burn everything down. Next, we move to Prussia. Technically not Scandinavia, but close enough in climate and melancholy. Queen Louise of Prussia married Frederick William III and instantly became the nation's symbol of grace. She was gentle, educated, and loved by the people, which in royal circles is usually the kiss of death. When Napoleon's armies invaded, Louise begged her husband to resist. She even met Napoleon in person in a now legendary confrontation where he tried to charm her while casually dismantling her country. She lost the argument, but kept her dignity. Louise died at 34, worn out by exile and grief, and was buried with flowers Napoleon himself sent, proof that even tyrants can appreciate a woman who refused to flatter them. Her death broke Prussia's heart, and for decades, she became a mythic widow before her time, the motherly martyr of German nationalism. Finally, a gentler note. Queen Josephine of Leuchtenberg, wife of Oscar I of Sweden, who reigned in the mid-1800s. She wasn't scandalous, she wasn't tragic, just quietly steadfast in an era when royalty was losing its magic. When her husband died, Josephine didn't remarry or fade away. She turned her attention to charity, hospitals, and education. Her letters reveal a woman who accepted widowhood as peace, not punishment. She lived to see the birth of modern constitutional monarchy, and when she died, she was remembered not as a ruler's wife, but as a woman who'd outlasted every storm her crown could summon. The Scandinavian queens didn't die in flames or rebellions. They died slowly, of isolation, illness, or memory. Their stories are quieter, but their loneliness runs deep. In the vast palaces of Copenhagen, Stockholm, and Berlin, their portraits still hang, soft, sad faces, dressed in pearls and patience. And if you listen closely, you can almost hear the silence they left behind, the long, slow sigh of women who ruled empires and never really belonged to them.
Now, we'll drift further west, across gray seas and centuries, toward a kingdom where widowhood was practically a royal tradition, a land of beheaded husbands, ambitious stepmothers, and stubborn survival. The Tudor dynasty was short, but it burned like a candle dropped into a pile of dry paper. At its center stood Henry VIII, a man who wanted to be everything: warrior, poet, reformer, lover, and most of all, immortal. He didn't quite manage immortality, but he did leave behind a magnificent trail of broken marriages, headless queens, and traumatized children. And tonight, we'll drift through the quiet aftermath of his romantic chaos, the women who survived him, if only barely. Catherine of Aragon was never supposed to end up like this. She arrived in England as a young Spanish princess, educated, dignified, and married to Prince Arthur, Henry's older brother. Arthur promptly died, because that's what Tudor heirs tended to do. Catherine waited in limbo for years, until Henry decided she was worth marrying himself. For a while, it was perfect. She adored him, he adored her, and England adored them both. Then came the problem: no son. After years of pregnancies and heartbreak, only one child survived, a daughter, Mary. Henry decided the problem wasn't biology, it was destiny. He convinced himself God was punishing him for marrying his brother's widow, and so began the infamous "the king wants a divorce" saga. Catherine refused to accept it. She called herself queen until the day she died, living her last years in isolation, in a damp, drafty castle. She died still loyal, still Henry's wife in her mind, signing her last letter, "Yours as the time of my life." History calls her stubborn, but really, she was just the only Tudor who took her vows seriously. If Catherine was duty, Anne Boleyn was temptation. She was witty, sharp-tongued, and far too confident for her own good. Henry fell for her like a teenager with a lute. He tore England apart for her, split from Rome, invented his own church, and crowned her queen. For a brief, glittering moment, Anne had everything. But then, like Catherine, she failed to produce a son. Instead, she gave birth to a daughter, a small, red-haired girl named Elizabeth. Anne's enemies multiplied. The same court that had bowed before her now whispered treason and adultery. Henry listened, because it was easier than admitting he'd made another mistake. Anne was arrested in 1536, tried in a court designed to condemn her, and executed on Tower Green. They say she laughed before the axe fell, that she forgave her enemies, that she prayed for the king's soul, but mostly she just became a ghost that England could never quite forget. Her daughter would return one day, wearing a crown and a look that said, "Remember me now." Henry married Jane Seymour 11 days after Anne's execution, because grief, apparently, has a schedule. Jane was gentle, quiet, the Tudor equivalent of a safe choice. She gave Henry the one thing he wanted most, a legitimate son, Edward. But childbirth took her life soon after. For once, Henry actually mourned her. He buried her with honors, wore black for months, and later asked to be buried beside her. Jane is the only one of his 6 wives who didn't have to watch her luck run out. Next came Anne of Cleves, a political marriage arranged by portrait. Henry saw her picture, thought she looked lovely, and promptly regretted it the moment she arrived. He called her the Flanders mare, which tells you everything you need to know about Henry's people skills. They were married for 6 months. Then Henry annulled the marriage, claiming it had never been consummated. Anne didn't protest. She took the settlement, castles, a generous income, and the official title of the king's sister. While Henry continued ruining other lives, Anne lived comfortably, throwing parties, hunting, and staying
very, very out of politics. She outlived all of Henry's other wives. Sometimes the trick isn't winning, it's walking away early. Henry's fifth wife, Catherine Howard, was everything Anne of Cleves wasn't. Young, flirtatious, and disastrously unprepared. She was barely a teenager when they married. Henry by this time was middle-aged, paranoid, and suffering from leg ulcers the size of small rebellions. Catherine's past caught up with her. Old letters, old lovers, and the kind of gossip that didn't stay secret long. She was accused of adultery, dragged to the Tower, and executed at 19. Her last words were quiet, but the legend says she whispered, "I die a queen, but I would have rather had been the wife of Culpeper, the man she truly loved." Finally, the last wife, Catherine Parr, educated, calm, and sensible enough to avoid both politics and flattery. She cared for Henry like a nurse cares for a difficult patient. She read to him, helped him reconcile with his daughters, and somehow survived the paranoia that had killed so many before her. When Henry died in 1447, Catherine finally exhaled. She remarried, for love this time, to Thomas Seymour, the ambitious brother of Henry's third wife. It didn't end well. Thomas flirted inappropriately with young Princess Elizabeth, which is not a good career move when your wife is the Dowager Queen. Catherine died in childbirth a year later. Her husband was executed soon after. Even in peace, the Tudors found a way to make widowhood exhausting. By the time the last Tudor wife was buried, England had become a different place, a country suspicious of marriage, haunted by queens, and ruled by a girl who'd learned every possible lesson from her father's mistakes. Elizabeth I never married. She didn't need to. She had watched what marriage did to women like her mother. Instead, she ruled alone, with a kind of icy brilliance that made her father's ghost seem almost clumsy. The wives of Henry VIII were supposed to produce heirs. Instead, they produced history, and in their quiet ends, in their letters and prayers and execution speeches, they outlived him in every way that mattered. Now, the fire's low again, and the Tudor ghosts have settled back into their portraits. But there's still one more place to wander tonight, a kingdom far away from London, where kings fell quickly and their widows learned how to rule in silence.
It's the 1500s again. Europe smells like gunpowder, wet velvet, and bad decisions. And while kings keep getting themselves executed, their wives are slowly learning the art of survival. Because in Spain and Portugal, queens weren't just ornaments. They were pawns, partners, and occasionally quiet conquerors. They called her Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad. And that's really all most people remember. But like most women nicknamed Mad in history, the reality was much less insanity and much more politics. Juana was the daughter of Isabella and Ferdinand, the superstar monarchs who gave Spain both its empire and its Inquisition. She married Philip the Handsome, a Habsburg prince whose nickname aged very poorly. He was beautiful in that early 1500s way. Long hair, sharp jawline, and exactly the level of arrogance you'd expect from a man literally called the Handsome. Juana adored him. He tolerated her. When her mother died, Juana became Queen of Castile, but Philip wanted the crown too. Their marriage dissolved into power struggles, jealousy, and emotional wreckage. When Philip died suddenly in 1506, some say of fever, some say of karma. Juana reportedly refused to let his body go. She traveled with his coffin for months, sleeping beside it, praying beside it, and terrifying everyone around her. The story spread. The queen had gone mad. In truth, she was grieving and surrounded by men eager to use that grief to lock her away. Her father, Ferdinand, declared her unfit to rule and imprisoned her in Tordesillas, a convent prison she would never leave. She spent nearly 50 years there, A queen in name only, the rightful ruler of Spain, reduced to a rumor. Juana never signed away her throne. She just stopped being asked to speak. Sometimes madness is convenient for everyone, except the person accused of it. Now let's drift to Lisbon, where candlelight flickers against white marble, and the river smells faintly of salt and empire. Here, in the late 18th century, we meet Maria I, the first queen regnant of Portugal. She was kind, devout, and disastrously unlucky. Her reign began with promise, reform, prosperity, a softer touch than her father's iron rule. But then came the losses, her husband, her beloved eldest son, and the slow crumbling of her mind under grief.
They called her Maria the Pious, and later Maria the Mad, because history loves to recycle its adjectives. Her surviving son, João, took over as regent. He didn't depose her, he just gently took the crown away while she prayed in her chambers and sang hymns to a court that had stopped listening. When Napoleon's troops invaded in 1807, Maria was carried onto a ship bound for Brazil, wrapped in silence and royal blankets. She died there, far from home, still believing herself queen, still whispering the names of her dead. Next, we float a few decades forward. The Spanish monarchy is wobbling again, a long tradition by now. Isabella II became queen at 3 years old, which, as you can imagine, is not an ideal age for dealing with military coups. By the time she was a teenager, the court was a nest of corruption, gossip, and badly dressed generals. Her arranged marriage, to her cousin naturally, was a disaster. They disliked each other instantly, and she took comfort in the company of court favorites, male and female alike, which scandalized the newspapers and delighted the gossips. She was forced to abdicate in 1868, fleeing to France with her jewels, her pride, and a level of exhaustion only monarchs and mothers understand. In exile, she lived quietly, still hosting tea with that faint royal dignity that never quite dies. When she finally died in 1904, Spain barely noticed. The country had moved on. But somewhere in Madrid, a few old courtiers probably lifted their glasses and whispered, "She did better than most."
And finally, we reach the twilight of monarchy itself. The 20th century is waking up. Crowns are losing their shine. Europe is learning about things like parliaments and revolutions. In Lisbon, the last queen waits. Amélie of Orleans married King Carlos I of Portugal in 1886. She was elegant, charitable, and entirely unsuited for what was about to happen. In 1908, while traveling through Lisbon, the royal carriage was ambushed. Carlos was shot. Their eldest son, Luis Felipe, was shot. Amélie threw herself over her younger son, Manuel, shielding him with her body. The assassins fled. Amélie survived. 2 years later, the monarchy was gone. Portugal became a republic, and Amélie, once the queen of a proud empire, was just a widow in exile. She lived quietly in France, giving interviews now and then, her voice soft, her manner still regal. When asked once if she ever stopped being queen, she smiled and said, "No one ever stops being what they were born to be, but one must learn to live without it." The wives of executed kings, the widows of fallen monarchs, and the women who outlasted entire dynasties, they all share something rare. Not tragedy, that's too simple. It's endurance, a kind of royal melancholy that makes them seem eternal, even when the crowns are gone and the castles are museums. They survived by retreating, by mourning quietly, by learning that power doesn't always sit on a throne. Sometimes it sits in a memory, in a portrait, in a whispered story told centuries later. When we say their names softly, by firelight. As the night draws long, the hour is late, the ghosts are patient, but we still have one more place to visit, a palace where beauty, betrayal, and bloodlines tangled like fine lace.
France loved beauty. It also loved to destroy it. And no one embodied that better than its royal brides. The women brought in from foreign courts, taught to smile, to curtsy, and to die gracefully when the time came. Tonight, we'll linger with a few of them, the famous, the forgotten, and the quietly miserable. You already know her name, but not the sound of her last breath. Marie Antoinette was born in Vienna, the 15th child of Empress Maria Theresa, one of the most powerful women in Europe. At 14, she was sent to France to marry the awkward, indecisive Dauphin, Louis Auguste, later Louis XVI. Her life became a costume change, corsets, powder, and endless lessons in etiquette. She wasn't allowed to bring even her pet dog across the border because everything Austrian had to go. When she entered Versailles, she entered a world so artificial that even the smiles smelled of perfume. And still she tried. She hosted plays, wrote letters home, and waited for her husband to stop being, well, himself. It took 7 years for their marriage to be consummated, which, in the gossip ecosystem of Versailles, was like waiting 7 years to light a fuse. When she finally had children, the rumors only got worse, that they weren't his, that she was bankrupting France, that she spent her days bathing in milk and gold dust. She didn't. She just built a little village on the palace grounds where she could pretend for an hour or two that she wasn't drowning in expectations.
But Versailles was a gilded volcano, and when it erupted in 1789, Marie was the perfect scapegoat. She was foreign, beautiful, and rumored to say, "Let them eat cake." She didn't, of course, but the myth was too good to die. When she was finally brought to the guillotine in 1793, she was calm, 40 years old, widowed, and dressed in plain white linen. As she climbed the scaffold, she accidentally stepped on the executioner's foot and whispered, "Pardon me, sir. I did not do it on purpose." It was her last act of etiquette. The only one of Marie Antoinette's children to survive the revolution was Marie Thérèse, imprisoned as a teenager in the Temple Tower. Her parents, her brother, her aunt, all dead. She spent years in solitary confinement, surrounded by silence and guards who refused to speak. When she was finally released, she was 20. Her hair had gone white. She lived in exile, married a cousin, and tried, painfully, to rebuild a normal life in a Europe that had moved on. They called her Madame Royale, but she was really just a woman who'd watched an entire world vanish through a prison window. She never smiled easily again. Let's float back a few decades to a gentler, quieter time, before the guillotine, before revolution. Here sits Marie Leszczyńska, a Polish princess who became Queen of France almost by accident. She was chosen to marry Louis XV mostly because she wasn't politically threatening, which is a polite way of saying she was inoffensive, devout, and unlikely to start a war. At first, Louis adored her. They had 10 children, but eventually the king grew bored. Because of course he did. He filled Versailles with mistresses, Madame de Pompadour, then Madame du Barry, women who knew how to make boredom look fashionable. Marie stayed polite. She prayed, painted, and gradually disappeared behind her own curtains. When she died in 1768, France barely noticed. Her husband didn't attend the funeral, but her quiet grace outlasted his vanity, and her descendants would someday rule again, briefly, before losing their heads. Now, further back, to the 1600s, when velvet was still a political statement, Anne of Austria, wife of Louis XIII, was a woman both underestimated and over-surveilled.
She spent 20 years married to a man who barely spoke to her. He suspected her of everything,
infidelity, espionage, even witchcraft at one point. Still, she waited. When Louis died, Anne became regent for her son, the future Louis XIV, the so-called Sun King. And that's when she truly came alive. With the help of Cardinal Mazarin, she held France together through civil war, rebellion, and near bankruptcy. By the time her son took the throne, France was stable again, and Anne quietly stepped back into the shadows. She died peacefully, which, in French royal history, is practically an achievement. Before Anne, there was Marie de Medici, Italian, opulent, and chronically allergic to restraint. She married Henry IV of France, who was charming, popular, and fatally unlucky. When he was assassinated in 1610, Marie became regent for their son. She ruled with a mix of grandeur and chaos, commissioning palaces, portraits, and political disasters. Eventually, her son grew up, fired her advisors, and exiled her. She wandered Europe like a fallen empress, writing angry letters and refusing to admit defeat. She died in poverty in Cologne, her jewels long sold, her pride intact. If dignity were currency, Marie de Medici would have died rich. By the 18th century, Versailles had become less a palace and more a mausoleum. The chandeliers still sparkled, the gardens still whispered, but the laughter was gone. Every gilded mirror reflected the same truth, that France had turned its queens into fragile ornaments, easy to admire, easier to replace. They were punished for being too foreign, too extravagant, too quiet, too alive. And when the revolution finally came, it wasn't just a political reckoning, it was personal. The guillotine wasn't for kings alone. It was for centuries of silent wives. The candles are low now. Outside the palace windows, the night feels heavier. You can almost hear the echo of silk against marble, the rustle of unseen gowns gliding past. But we're not quite done. Russia didn't do small emotions. When they loved, it was absolute. When they ruled, it was terrifying. And when they grieved, it could last an entire reign. Let's wander through those echoing marble halls and meet a few women who turned survival into an empire. The story begins with a woman who technically shouldn't have existed in royal history at all. Catherine I started life as Martha Skowronska, a peasant, possibly illiterate, probably exhausted. She was captured during one of Russia's endless wars, brought into service, and somehow ended up in the orbit of Peter the Great. Peter, a man both brilliant and entirely unhinged, tore Russia into the modern age with his bare hands, and Catherine quietly followed, patching up the pieces he broke. She wasn't educated, but she understood Peter's moods better than any minister. She soothed him when he raged, laughed when others trembled, and managed to love him without drowning in his chaos. When he died in 1725, Catherine did something no Russian woman had done before. She ruled. The army, the nobles, everyone expected a puppet. What they got was competence. Short reign, yes, barely 2 years, but steady, pragmatic, and astonishing for someone who'd once scrubbed floors. When she died, she left behind a precedent that even in Russia, a woman could sit on the throne and the world wouldn't end. Next comes her daughter, Elizabeth Petrovna, a woman who inherited her father's charisma and her mother's appetite for life. She wasn't supposed to be queen. She just decided to be. In 1741, dressed in a soldier's uniform and a confidence no army could stop, she stormed the barracks, shouted, "Who wants to follow me?" and became Empress of Russia before sunrise. Elizabeth refused to sign death warrants, which for 18th century Russia was almost saintly behavior. She spent her time building palaces, throwing endless masquerade balls, and dressing up her courtiers like porcelain dolls. Beneath the silk, she was lonely. She never married, never had children, but she kept her court alive with laughter, as if joy could keep the cold out. When she died, she left no heirs, only chandeliers, debts, and a memory of warmth. Then came the most famous, Catherine II, born Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst, a minor German princess. She arrived in Russia at 15, speaking barely a word of the language, and married Grand Duke Peter, a man who loved toy soldiers more than his own wife. She learned quickly, keep quiet, read everything, and never let them see you panic. When Peter became emperor, his reign lasted about 6 months. Catherine staged a coup, had him quietly removed, and replaced him with herself. From that point on, she didn't just survive Russia, she became Russia. She corresponded with philosophers, rewrote laws, expanded borders, and introduced the Enlightenment to a country still half frozen in medieval darkness. Her love life was legendary and endlessly exaggerated, but what mattered was that she ruled for 34 years, longer than almost any man before her. When she died, her courtiers wept, her enemies relaxed, and Europe realized that a German girl with patience and steel had out-czarred them all. Jump forward to the late 19th century and meet Maria Fyodorovna, the Danish princess who became wife of Alexander III. She was elegant, practical, and mother to the last Tsar, Nicholas II. When her husband died in 1894, Maria became the Dowager Empress, a title that sounded peaceful, but wasn't. She distrusted her daughter-in-law, Alexandra, hated Rasputin on sight, and watched the monarchy she'd helped build sink beneath the weight of revolution and incompetence. When the Romanovs were executed in 1918, Maria was in exile. She never truly believed her son was dead. She kept a room ready for him, table set, portraits polished, just in case. She died in Denmark in 1928, still waiting for a knock that never came. And here's the last flicker. Alexandra Fyodorovna, born a German princess named Alex of Hesse, granddaughter of Queen Victoria, and fated to become the final Empress of Russia. She married Nicholas II, a man kind-hearted but catastrophically indecisive. She believed their love was sacred, and maybe it was, but Russia doesn't forgive fairy tales. When their only son, Alexei, was born with hemophilia, Alexandra turned to mystics, prayers, and one very strange monk, Grigory Rasputin. The more she trusted him, the more the public despised her. Whispers of corruption, adultery, witchcraft, the usual Russian menu. When the revolution came in 1917, she went quietly, writing letters from captivity as if manners could still save her. In July 1918, in a basement in Yekaterinburg, the last Empress of Russia was killed with her family. She died clutching a small icon. The candlelight of the empire went out with her. Even now, if you walk through the palaces at Tsarskoye Selo, you can almost feel their presence. Women in jewels, women in mourning black, women who learned how to stand still while history broke around them. Russia never really buried its queens. It just let the snow cover them. And beneath that silence, they're still there, frozen but undefeated. The night is deep now, and the fire is nearly gone. We've crossed from England to France, from Spain to Russia, and every palace has whispered the same truth, that behind every execution, every coronation, every revolution, there was always a woman watching quietly, outliving
the noise.
There's a moment after every storm, that terrible quiet where nothing moves, but you can feel that something enormous has passed through. That's what happened to Europe after its monarchies cracked. The kings vanished, some by bullets, some by treaties, and their queens were left behind, half-living relics of a vanished world. They were the final witnesses, and in their silence, history started whispering differently. When most royal women faded into polite exile, Marie of Romania did something radical. She wrote. She'd been a granddaughter of Queen Victoria, married off at 17 to a prince in a country she barely knew. But unlike so many before her, she adapted. She learned Romanian, wore folk dresses, and listened to the people. During World War I, she didn't hide in palaces. She went to hospitals, bandaged soldiers, and walked through muddy trenches in pearls. When her country fell apart, she personally went to Paris to plead for its restoration, and succeeded. By the 1920s, Marie wasn't just a queen, she was a symbol. Her memoirs sold internationally. She became Europe's first celebrity monarch, but beneath the charm was fatigue. She outlived her husband, outlasted her empire, and spent her last years watching fascism rise like smoke over her children's thrones. The queen who once saved a nation died quietly, pen in hand. Zita was 24 when her husband, Emperor Karl I, was forced to abdicate after World War I. They fled into exile with 8 children and almost no money. When Karl died young, just 34, Zita wore black for the rest of her life. She believed monarchy would return, that her sons would reclaim Austria. They never did. She moved between convents, farms, small apartments, always carrying the old imperial dignity, as if the crown still floated above her head even without a throne beneath her feet. When she finally died in 1989, at 96 years old, her coffin was carried through Vienna, and for one brief day, the people lined the streets again, as if the empire itself had briefly remembered her. If history's queens were mourned, Wallis was blamed. A twice-divorced American socialite, she was the reason King Edward VIII gave up the British throne in 1936. He said, "I cannot live without the woman I love." The world called it romance. The palace called it treason. They married. He became the Duke of Windsor. She became Her Grace, but never Her Majesty. They lived in exile in France, throwing parties to distract from the fact that they had nowhere else to go. Behind the glitter was boredom, bitterness, and a haunting sense of what if. When Edward died, Wallis faded into silence, living alone in her Paris home, surrounded by memories and empty champagne bottles. A ghost of love haunted by a crown she never wore. Fast forward to the mid-20th century. Queen Soraya Esfandiari Bakhtiari, the Sleeping Beauty of Tehran, was everything a post-war monarch wanted. Beauty, grace, modernity. She was adored by the people and the press. But there was one problem. She couldn't bear children. Her husband, the Shah of Iran, loved her, but duty demanded an heir. In 1958, after 7 years of marriage, he wept publicly as he divorced her. She left the palace with nothing but her dresses and her dignity. Soraya turned briefly to film, writing, acting, wandering through Europe, but the sparkle never returned. She once said, "After I left Iran, I was never really awake again." She died alone in 2001, her fortune gone, her heart still bound to a kingdom that no longer existed. Across continents, across centuries, from the Tudors to the Tsars, from Versailles to Tehran, the story ends the same. The crowns melt, the palaces become museums, the portraits fade, and yet somehow their ghosts remain. In the scent of a garden, in the hush of an empty ballroom, in the echo of silk across a marble floor. These were the women who watched history happen from behind veils and mirrors. They were adored, exiled, silenced, erased, but never truly gone. Because every time we whisper their names, Every time someone lights a candle or writes a line about them, they rise again, not as queens, but as women who endured everything power could give and take away.
If you're still awake, congratulations. You've just drifted through nearly 1,000 years of royal misfortune, betrayal, loneliness, and a few too many headless husbands. Now, as we wind down, let's breathe out the history for a moment and look at what really remained after the crowns, the castles, the endless ceremonies disappeared. Because under all the gold, under the silks, under the Latin inscriptions and family crests, they were just people, tired, confused, often trapped, occasionally defiant, and always, somehow, alone. If you look closely, it's the same story told over and over, just with different accents, different hairstyles, and occasionally more lace. A king sins, a queen suffers. The people cheer or riot, and the chroniclers move on. But those women, they linger. They appear in letters, in the corners of portraits. Sometimes in small details historians almost forget to mention. A half-burned candle in a widow's room, a letter that was never sent, a prayer book stained with tears. We read about them centuries later and think she must have been strong. But strength, in their world, usually meant quiet endurance, waiting for the storm to pass and hoping it didn't take your children with it. Kings are easy to remember. They have dates, wars, and official portraits. Queens are trickier. Their stories are usually tucked in the margins, recorded by men who didn't quite know what to do with women who thought, or felt, or refused to die quietly. But if you listen closely, you can still hear them beneath the official history. Catherine Howard's trembling voice as she begs for mercy. Marie Antoinette's quiet dignity as she writes her final letter to her sister-in-law. Anne Boleyn's small, almost ironic smile as she says her last words. Even Soraya's sigh in a Paris apartment, 50 years and 1,000 miles away from the palace she left behind. These moments don't fit neatly into textbooks. They belong in whispers, in late-night monologues, in the kind of history you listen to with your eyes half closed. Maybe we tell these stories because they remind us that power doesn't protect anyone from heartbreak, that even when you wear a crown, you still wait for letters that don't come. You still grieve. You still grow old, wondering if you were ever really loved. Or maybe we tell them because they're strangely comforting, proof that no matter how strange the world gets, people have always been people, jealous, hopeful, a little lost, and yes, occasionally very bad at choosing husbands. So tonight, as the palace lights go out one by one, as the queens fade back into their portraits and the ghosts settle in their corridors, we leave them there, still waiting, still watching, still part of the quiet hum of history. Because history isn't made only by those who ruled, it's kept alive by those who endured. So, good night to Anne, to Catherine, to Marie, to Soraya, to Farida, to all the wives, the widows, and the women history forgot to crown properly. And good night to you for staying through the stories. You've just walked through centuries of heartbreak, and somehow you made it out alive. If you enjoyed drifting through this long, strange corridor of history, maybe let the next story play. We'll pick up another forgotten thread, another family, another disaster waiting politely in the archives. But for now, turn the light low, close your eyes, and remember, every crown eventually falls silent, but the whispers never stop.